G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you're having a fantastic weekend. Now if I look a little bit drowsy in my eyes, I was up all night, but I did luckily get to do a fantastic podcast that I'll bring you in a couple of days, maybe a week. I've got to do some editing on it, but I think you'll get a lot out of it looking at, of course, the war in Ukraine and potential protracted wars in other areas around the globe in a modern contemporary space. But bear with me if I slur a little bit. Now, legends, as always, of course, we have a lot to go over. Of course, I'm going to show you the maps. I'm going to show you where things are changing and some claims being made as well. I'm going to talk about the Munich Security Conference, what is being said there, potentially around negotiations, as well as what the Americans are saying about the Europeans and that massive storm that has erupted there. I'm speaking about the Romanians, the Germans. I want to talk about the psychological impact on soldiers at the front line due to this actually going on. I touched on that the other day, but I think we need to re-go into it because it is something that is not spoken about. But as a former soldier, as someone who speaks to guys, I believe this is very, very important, especially when we know there's this limbo happening at the moment of where Ukraine is, where America is, where Russia is at the moment. That can have huge, huge effects. And now, what I want to present to you first are my predictions for 2025 from my video right around New Year's. Now, my predictions of number one is false flag, more informational control, division and tension within NATO and the EU. There'll be a falling appetite for war. Guns will potentially fall silent, but with an annex to that, there may be another proxy war occur somewhere else as protracted conflict, when it doesn't end with complete surrender, you end up seeing it move into other theatres. We will see American and Russian relations build. Russia try to increase BRICS' influence and their cooperation. Now, what I will say is earlier than I thought, we've seen, I think, a lot of these ticked off. So I'll give myself a little pat on the back. But one we need to speak about. We can't, of course, not speak about the incident that occurred at Chernobyl. Of course, the very infamous nuclear power plant and also a fantastic HBO series. But of course, what we've seen overnight is a drone impact Chernobyl. Let me show you some of the footage from this. So we see in the outskirts of the sarcophagus. So this is basically just the cover over the very thick concrete beneath it. We're going to talk about that concrete and if there is really any threat to a radioactive leak. We see this is from security camera footage of the area of a drone striking the Chernobyl, that is incredibly loud, the Chernobyl power plant. We can see it's come through the roof here, but as far as the sarcophagus itself, that is still intact, and this is the engine of said to be a Shahid Quran drone. Now again, none of this is beyond reasonable doubt, and I'm concerned that a lot of people aren't putting any suspicion towards this. Now, I've heard this from my local shitty radio station this morning all the way through to the world's media. And I think the problem is here is people are just taking at this time official statements as just the truth. But what we need to look at, and look, we need to apply some Occam's razor theory here of who does this benefit? But it's being shared by, of course, everyone. So the informational impact of this has been very, very positive. But I want to just look at this because this sums up a lot. So you get this footage last night of a Russian drone striking containment structure of reactor number 4. Of course, the very infamous reactor that went kaboom. But, you know, no doubts about that it was a Russian drone here. And I think this sums up what a lot of people are thinking, that Russia is on the verge of securing everything it wants via peace negotiations, but for some reason decides to launch a half-assed attack that jeopardizes all of that. Who benefits from this? Not Russia, only Ukraine. In any case, this war is still winding down to the same conclusion. But that is true. And in my opinion, this is either an accident, an equipment failure, jamming, or a false flag. It does not make sense for Russia to risk any of that further Western escalation when it's looking like they may get a lot of what they want from the US, especially with Trump's statements now. Why then would they jeopardize this with, to quote that guy, a half-assed attack? Especially with a drone like this. Knowing the thickness of that sarcophagus, and I'm sure that the Russians know that very well, that is not going to have any impact on that. You're going to need multiple ballistic missiles. It would be a hell of a thing. But let's look over this. And we've seen from the High Representatives of Foreign Affairs for the EU and all the other European Union leaders, well, not all of them, but a lot of them, Russia recklessly Russia recklessly attacked again the Chernobyl nuclear site. Such attacks on civilian sites are unacceptable. It shows again Russia is not looking for peace. And we see this coming out too from Energy Minister of Ukraine, and Ukraine is urging the international community to urgently intensify efforts in response to Russia's unprecedented act of nuclear terrorism. The attack on the shelter of the 4th unit, the Chernobyl, poses a threat to the entire continent. But again, the question that needs to be asked in this is why? And one of my contacts behind the scenes has then sent me this across. Incredibly experienced guy. Worth consideration. Zelensky is currently at a security conference in Munich. This random Russian drone hits the shroud over the Chernobyl plant is rather conveniently timed for Ukraine, considering their situation and need to increase support to keep things going. Theory number 1. A drone crashed into it. No payload, so it was an observation drone flying incredibly low over a demilitarized area. The same gentleman here has actually been speaking to me about the footage looked more like a fireball than an impact too. Of course, that could be fuel aboard the drones as well. Theory 2. Targeted or accidental drone strike of a demilitarized zone. But what would have prompted the drone to be in that area anyway? And what does Russia have to gain from this, other than turn international sentiment against them as an own goal? You're putting the football into your own net. It's not really adding up. And after now 3 years of war, why would Russia now target this facility on a half-assed attack when they have multiple ballistic missiles very close to an area that is fairly demilitarized? So what I'm saying is that things just are not adding up. Now, before we get into when and why we could see false flags attack and why that was the number one on my predictions for the year, now I'm not saying this is. It may be an accident, may be targeted. You know, there's no beyond reasonable doubt either way in this, but if we add what makes sense. But I want to talk about, is there any real risk due to this strike? Now, this should never have been targeted in any way at all. The sarcophagus beneath what we saw of that tin roof, the sarcophagus, which is reinforced concrete, is believed to be several meters thick, at least in the critical areas. And if Russia wanted to cause a nuclear incident on this, or if anyone wanted to cause a nuclear incident on this, it would need to be an array of bunker-busting ballistic missiles, and that would be very, very impossible to hide. So I think with everything, we need to step into any scenario with suspicion. And a lot of this has been caused by blatant lies previously in The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The farmers killed in Poland from a stray Russian missile that turned out to be not a Russian missile, so we don't hear about it anymore, from Nord Stream to then the Novokakovka Dam, and a lot of other incidents as well. So at the end of the day, we need to approach any of this that has such massive ramifications with suspicion. But it's disappointing to see that these world leaders, these people with massive platforms, are just taking it on face value or what would fit a narrative rather than questioning, does it make sense or does it not? So why have I said that I believe a false flag this year is very, very likely? And it's not just one way. I believe it's far more likely for Ukraine, but it could be very, very likely as well for Russia to try and reduce any Western support. But I believe at this point in time, Zelensky could walk into Brussels, do whatever he wants, and it would still be, he'd never lose support of those behind him. US, different story. We'll talk on that. But when do you have false flags? Pretext for wider war, rallying domestic support in periods of low public morale or opposition to the war. So when we go through this, what I want you to do is add up which ones are relevant for X or Y country. That will give us a better idea of who we may see it from. Provoking enemy reaction to seek to escalate a conflict to force the enemy into making a strategic mistake. Okay, so rallying domestic support, provoking, gaining international support, trying to secure alliances or military aid, as we've seen from even the energy minister have said, discrediting internal opposition, situations with significant internal dissent or opposition to the government or its policies, that is, say, an overthrow, diversion from internal problems, economic crisis, political scandal, or civil unrest, divert attention from internal issues by creating an external threat, sowing discord amongst allies, seeking to weaken alliances or create divisions amongst enemies' allies, peace negotiation talks, when preparing for or during peace negotiations to strengthen one's bargaining position by creating a situation that pressures the enemy to make concessions. Now, if you've watched my channel, you've seen these slides a lot, and I've used them again and again. Why then do we see false flags? Manipulate public perception or gaining a strategic advantage. That strike there, a Russian drone, if they've targeted that with something that was never going to cause damage, where is the strategic advantage in that at all? Okay, number one, justification for war or escalation. We've seen a lot of these false flags leading to war before. Demonising the enemy. Betray the enemy as aggressive, dangerous, or inhumane. Diverting attention. Divert attention for other issues such as internal problems. Provoking a response. Undermining confidence in the enemy. By framing the enemy for a false attack, a country can undermine the enemy's credibility and sow discord amongst its allies, creating confusion or misinformation. These attacks are typically covert operations. They can be. False flag operations can severely damage the credibility of the country that carried them out. So if you get caught, it can really damage you the other way as well. Now, going through these slides, you can see why I believe there is a very, very high risk of this. Ukraine at the moment looking at a negotiated settlement that is not going to be in their favour from the US, trying to rally support. There is internal problems as well. So you can see why I believe this is very, very likely, if not potentially we have maybe seen, and why with anything like this that is such a demonising around the world instantly, and brought up from my local radio show through to Reuters and Fox and CNN and everyone else, to YouTubers and bloggers and everyone, why I think you should wade into this with suspicion when if we apply Occam's razor of what is the most likely here, it doesn't seem to add up because Russia's looking like they're about to get handed everything that they want. Why would they then jeopardise this? So we'll see. There's even people saying it's a 5-dimensional chess game where it is a Russian false flag, try and discredit the Ukrainians. Now that is, sucking on the end of the glass Barbie. But, at this point in time, we never bloody know. Let's have a quick squiz at the maps before we go into negotiations and psychological impact of those negotiations. So, of course, we have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, the red areas, occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, if we hit on these two arrows, what we get is red check. Now, this red check will show any gains made over the past 24 hours by the Russian forces, blue check, vice versa for the Ukrainians, but today we only have movement by the Russian forces. We see northern push out of Zelenivkia and then more push through Dashny as well. There is some horrible footage coming out of Dashny of just the amount of servicemen that have been killed in this pocket here. So we need to have a look, but the one interesting bit here, I think, is if we step from the 14th to the 15th, we see this movement of grey zone right up to this tree line here. And that this is only a 1 kilometre gap on this main service route leading out of this very deep, 9-10 kilometre pocket. Now, AMK Maps, he says that Ukrainian forces have begun their retreat from the remnants of the Kursk salient. So this is the whole pocket. He's claiming that they are pulling out of here. Constantinople, this is a very important area too. So we know there is definitely movements through this sector. No other movements on this map. I don't believe, I actually haven't looked at Kursk. I've looked everywhere else. No changes on Kursk, but we're going to compare a Syriac map to this, and this is what we see here. So what we're looking at is this red dot right here. This is Sverdlikovo. We know there was advancement into here the other day, confirmed over then all of the maps, and Syriac is saying that the last 3 days, Russian army captured 60% of the locality of Sverdlikovo and began advancing east of these areas, and the Ukrainian army completely recaptured the locality of Kositsia. So we'll have a look at where this is first. So down in here, that there is further movements into Sverdlikovo through this formerly occupied area of Russia. We know this has gone down to about a third of what it was at one point. Now, these other areas, these are much harder to actually find due to the very poor labeling on these maps. But what we are going to be looking for is we're going to look where a road actually runs in here. We can see where out of Martinovka, which is this blue dot, we compare in the middle here. So it's right in around this sector in here where Ukraine then had its ability there to recapture then this area of Kositsia. So still launching offensive campaigns. And of course, this will need more reserves deployed into Kursk as well. But we will continue to see what happens on the front line in this sector, and we will keep up with it, and we'll actually show you the maps and not just completely avoid them. So America has made some very, very big statements at the Munich Security Conference, and we're going to go over that, especially toward Europe. And a lot of a lot of European statesmen are pissed off about this. Just because he got no applause in the bloody amphitheatre doesn't mean there's a lot of people going, yeah, he's fucking right on that. But what I want to look at is, before we get into these negotiations and after we looked at the front lines, I want to talk about the psychological impact that these can really have. And this was sent across from another one of my contacts. Matt, the points you made about morale are very good. In my opinion, including the one about Ukraine needing negotiations to be quick. What I've said is, in limbo for guys at the front line, that is a very, very bad situation. The problem is that, conversely, it's in Russia's interest to drag them out, and it shouldn't be difficult to do. Putin has already stated that Zelensky is not legitimate given the expiration of his presidential term and cannot negotiate on Ukraine's behalf, so lengthening this out. If Putin wants new elections to be held before negotiations can take place, this adds a couple of weeks, or at least I'd say a couple of months, to the process at a bare minimum, and likely over a month. So dragging out this period of, I think there's a lot of threat of morale issues which could lead to catastrophes on the front line in this period of time. And that's just for the negotiations to even then start. But for these negotiations to hurt Ukrainian morale, they don't need to effectively start. They just need to be accepting as something that's going to happen. So what I've spoken about is the impact on the guys at the front line who have given so much to now look like it's going to really be turned a lot in Russia's favour, and it may be in Russia's favour to actually lengthen these out. And that psychological impact is going to hit the Russian forces as well, but in a more positive way. If you look what we have fought for, we're going to walk away with this. So it's very, very difficult. We're going to talk about post-war too. Furthermore, it seems Ukrainian forces have withstood the initial shock, which is true. This is significant, I think, because at this point, the men in the trenches can't be too sure what they're fighting for exactly, but they are still fighting. I know there is a lot of desertions in Ukraine, but evidently there's a very great deal of bravery as well, which is very true. Now, last night's podcast, I said I was up very, very late, was actually interviewing this gentleman here, Iskander Raymond. Very, very knowledgeable guy, and I've raved on this book before, and you can see it, I've made an absolute mess of it. I think every single page has some level of piece that is very valuable. And there's a piece in this he speaks about after the war, which I think could be very relevant here. Finally, how might the experience of a protracted warfare affect a great power's competitor's long-term internal stability? While the exhilaration of victory and the memory of shared sacrifices might act as a stimulant to national unity or consolidation, the general brutalization of society, especially if paired with the trauma of defeat, can also gravely accentuate centrifugal pressures, whether surrender leads to territorial loss, diplomatic subjugation, or merely a suite of humiliating concessions. Its effects can often be likened to an invisible but devastating bow wave. And this is something that I think is very, very important to look at, is if it's going how Trump is looking like, and Vance is looking like, and Hegseth is looking like, it will be seen as a defeat here. There will be territorial losses, there will be then humiliating concessions. And how will this trauma of defeat then affect internal stability too? Profoundly reshaping the nation's collective psyche, and in doing so, its internal politics. The release of these pent-up pressures and thus led to regime collapse, and gives some examples of this. And what I have said is, I think when this ends, we need to be looking internally, and there needs to be concerns about what may happen internally as well, given the sacrifice these guys have made, and given then the brutalization of what has occurred. Civil-military relations in particular have a tendency to become especially fraught, leading to an armed uprisings by disgruntled military personnel. The bitterness of defeat can form the dark loam within which populist, extremist and conspiratorial movements flourish. We already know that there are very extreme groups then operating too. At the time, it may be the enemy of my enemy is my friend with some of these groups, these nationalist groups from Europe and funding and supply, but there still needs to be an element of, if this war doesn't end on terms that Ukraine likes, how is this going to look? further sapping a reeling nation's energy from within. In its magisterial study of society efforts of military defeat, German cultural historian Wolfgang, I won't try and pronounce it, observes that for losers of protracted conflict, the creation of a new narrative or mythology justifying their defeat is more than a mere neurotic fiction of the imagination, and by providing a shield against the reality of unbearable to the psyche, it can be compared to the coagulation of blood and the formation of scabs necessary to heal a wound. In short, the drummed-up ideological fever, total military mobilisation and societal brutalisation inherent to protracted warfare can occasionally extract a heavy price, particularly if the great power in question is on the losing side. So how we see, and I'm not just talking Ukraine, I'm talking potentially Europe as well. Tectonic shifts in the balance of power can also lead to much wider convulsions and transformations in the international system, triggering waves of domestic reforms that sweep across borders and deeply alter the paths of state development. Consider, for example, the lasting impact of the Russian Revolution in 1917 between the whites and the reds. So I think this is something we really need to look at as well if there is a defeat in this, because we know there's going to be someone defeated. It's either going to be the Russians or the Ukrainians in this, and how Europe has thrown all its chips in. How will this actually look? And I think the pebble hitting the water is what a lot of people are looking at, but I think you need to look at then the waves radiating out from that and the problems that this can have, especially if Ukraine doesn't end up in the EU or NATO and loses a large section of territory. So, of course, the same would be happening if this was the other way. So, JD Vance, he has been walking around like the Randy in South Park Buffalo Soldier with a massive nutsack in Germany. And he's correct when he says the biggest threat to Europe is internal. I think a lot of the European leaders put a stick in their own bicycle spokes and every issue is, oh, fucking Putin, rather than going, well, okay, that may cause some issues, but you've got a hell of a lot more going on. You can't blame immigration crises. You can't blame some of these other things around financial competitiveness and all of this on someone else when you have had impact on this, and that has been occurring far beyond the last 3 or even 10 years. I believe Vance is incredibly correct on a lot of this, and he has really been calling out a lot of European states leaders, and Germany is not happy about this. Germany got grilled. German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius here said US President JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference was unacceptable. And it struck a chord because I believe he knows deep down a lot of it is true. What are some of the things that JD Vance said? If you're afraid of voices, the opinions and the conscience that guide your very own people, if you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you, nor, for that matter, is there anything you can do for the American people. Again, I've spoken about, and that touches on when I just spoke about after protracted conflict, how regimes look very different. And I've spoken very recently about the divisions in NATO and the EU as well. Yesterday's video, I spoke on this. Vance continues, for years, we have been told everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is built on the defence of democracy. But when we see European courts cancelling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask ourselves if we are holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I think there's a massive problem in the West at the moment that democracy is only democracy when you're agreeing with it. We see that with then the US election recently, that everyone would have been happy with democracy. Well, 50% would have been happy if it went one and 50% the other. And no matter which way it went, it would have been all democracy is getting undermined. But the biggest one, I think, recently is what has happened to Kalin Georgescu in Romania. Now, I'm not doubting that there is some level, and when we have reported this, some level of influence there, but we need to be realistic about its effect and realistic about, well, there's going to be this going into the future. And I guarantee if it was the other way, it would have been very, very quiet on this. And JD Vance has spoken about this.
Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election.
Actually goes a step further. They cancelled the results at the last minute, but have also now seeking legal ramifications that Mr. Georgescu now can't run again.
Based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, As I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do.
And there's been a lot of claims around this in the States. You can believe that this is happening.
You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
This is something that we brought up, that if that can be underwritten, if you can change an election due to a few $100,000 of digital advertising, as quote, Mr. Vance here, well, how strong is the democracy to begin with? And what we bring up is I believe in any election anywhere in the world, there's going to be some foreign influence. Look at Georgia. There's huge foreign influence. We only speak of it when it's one way. But there is going to be external influence on these elections. But what we need to assess is how much influence is it actually happening? Georgescu, it was quoted that he was getting unfairly pushed by the algorithm on TikTok. Well, I haven't seen any evidence that is actually the way it is. If you get more likes, more watch time, whatever, some are pushed and some are not. And it may be in the favour. But what I've seen, the biggest concern I brought up about this is now with a few $100,000 that election is cancelled and Georgescu may not be able to run again, that they've actually given Russia far more influence on the election because that has just been thrown out. So if Macron runs, Russia may go, well, we don't want Macron, so we'll make it look like we want him to win. So we'll put $500,000, which for a state is nothing. We'll put $500,000 towards Macron on digital advertising online. This will get caught and that'll just be shut down instantly. So you've actually sort of given some ammunition here as well. Now, it's dirty politics, I get it, but I think stepping into the digital age, we have to just seek around this, and what we have to look at is, okay, we know there's going to be a sway, but is it 50% or is it 1%? And personally, I think because it's an election year in Australia, I think the even ads on TV through to whatever is so little amount that it actually swings people more so than when they go to the shops and something expensive or policy brought forward. So we see very, very quiet clapping there. There's a hell of a lot of people involved. Now, what I want to look at is this. Now, this is J.D. Vance and Zelensky's team here as well, the US delegation, the Ukrainian delegation. And a lot of people have been pointing to the body language here that Ukraine doesn't look very happy about this. And we know that America is not shifting. Of course, this is Vance. This is Keith Kellogg here. Keith Kellogg will be going to Ukraine very soon at the Munich Security Conference. In this, they just talk about that they have had meetings, that it was positive, that they're working together. There's nothing groundbreaking in this. We don't know exactly what was said, but the body language here I think is somewhat telling, but that is, we're clutching at straws at that point in time. But we will see, but I don't think the US is going to budge. But I do believe it's too late for Europe to backfill where the US would leave that hole. They could have done it years ago, but there was too much reliance on cheap energy from Russia and cheap security from America. Now, this as well is an interview with then Zelensky, that I don't see the US has a concrete plan to end the war. I will have an official visit to Saudi Arabia, but I will not have meetings with Russia or the US there. Now, this is something that Trump spoke about, that in Munich Security Conference there would be talks, and then in Saudi there would be hosted talks between all three nations. But he's saying that I will not have meetings with Russia or the US. Now, the last thing I would want, if I was Zelensky, the last thing I would want is the US having this meeting without me, because the US may go forward with it. The delegation going to Saudi and the Russians, they may still hold the meeting. The last thing I want is me not there. Now, we don't see a concrete plan to end the war. In my opinion, if there was ever a time for Ukraine to deliver a realistic victory plan, and not a victory plan that consisted of, quote, just a wish list, this is what American leaders said about this, and Democratic leaders said about this too, that it was just a wish list, this is the time to deliver a realistic victory plan. And Ukraine's not going to get any more funding, I do not believe, if they do not lower that mobilisation down to 18. I think that, especially for a leader like Trump, will be an absolute nail in the coffin if Ukraine's not willing to do that. It was a nail in the coffin for the Biden administration. It's even more so for someone as transactional as Trump, who's already concerned about funding. and of course rare earths. So I think if there was ever a time for Ukraine to present a realistic victory plan that consisted of not just we need this, you need to do that, of we need this, but we're going to mobilise this, we will give you X amount in rare earths or whatever, now would be the bloody time to do it, because at this point in time it seems like it's all external, nothing internal. If I was Zelensky, I'd be writing up a new victory plan to do with mass mobilisation, fixing corruption, rare earths. Again, people say, Trump wants to go in and take everything from the land and do this and do that. That may be true, but Ukraine is in this existential war paradox. This war is existential for Ukraine, but then they're not willing, because they're saying, well, if you don't leave us with rare earths or we mobilise this, that we won't exist after. But what I'm saying is, well, you may not exist in the future if you don't do it, at least for the entire territory. So there is this paradox, and it's the same as the manpower paradox, that we don't have enough men at the front line, but if we mobilise these young men, we're not going to have enough men after the war. And this is the paradox it's in. And what I'm saying is, if you're not willing to make these decisions, well, there may need to be some realities, very tough realities seen to. But as I bring up in that psychological aspect, and as well from Mr. Rahman's book, how will this then look? Legends, I hope that you have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.